Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome back to the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and we're just returning from our time in Denver, where we just had our annual event. It was our largest one yet, and we had so many leaders come together, over 1,200 people coming in from all over the world, most from the U.S., but so many that come from international cities to just come together for these 3 days to really engage what's happening in the world. And it was just amazing to sit around and sit with so many people who are leading in every kind of area of culture you can imagine, whether it's education or science or research to media and journalism and entertainment, and pastors and leaders in the church and people leading nonprofits and institutions that are really shaping so much of how the church is engaging the world. And so it's such a privilege to get to be together and to just think well about so many difficult topics, and feels like some challenging areas that we as Christians are needing to think well about at a time when I think culturally people right now are wanting leadership, and they're saying, how are we going to find our way through some things where there seems like a lot of disagreement, a lot of tribalism, a lot of people becoming defensive and wanting to just defend their own views, but not always open to listening. And so today what we're going to do is actually let you listen in on one of the Q Talks, one of the interviews that I was able to do with two leaders who came together at Q. They're people who come from very opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, even from the faith spectrum. And in coming together, demonstrated for people what it looks like for people to get along who have every reason possible to disagree. And one of the things we released at Q Denver, and it's actually something you can find on our website, is a research project that over the last 2 years has been taking place to really understand how Americans are feeling about faith, religion, public life, that intersection that creates so much tension and seems to drive so many of the headlines, but disagreement today and legal pursuits and everything that sort of riles people up. You know, at Q, we wanted to address that with research to say, how are people feeling about the moment that we're in? And one of the stats that came back that was somewhat surprising, but also so informative, was that 95% of Americans agree on something. And here's what it was that they agreed on. 95% of Americans believe that people on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum demonize one another so severely that it makes finding common ground impossible. So think about that. 9.5 out of 10 Americans agree that on the opposite ends of ideas, theology, different things that people are finding to disagree about, politics, of course, that we demonize the other person so poorly that we just can't even come to the middle and try to find ways to get along and to work together for some common ground. And so I'm going to invite you into a conversation that took place at Q that I got to have with two leaders, people from opposite ends of the spectrum, as I said, but people who found common ground. And those two people were Jim Daly, an author and a broadcaster, but he's the president of Focus on the Family, and Ted Trimpa, somebody who's been a leading gay rights advocate for many, many years. And these two gentlemen live in Colorado. They share kind of the same space, the same state. They both care about being engaged in the culture, in society, and yet have completely different views about marriage, completely different views about how they should work for the common good and maybe even flourishing of people, and have different visions of that. And yet there was a common problem that they needed to address in Colorado. And in this story, you're going to see how these two people who most would never expect to ever see having dinner together, having conversation together, enjoying one another as human beings, as people, start to work together to do something. And let me tell you, this is what Americans are looking for. This is what people in the world are looking for in a time where there's so much discussion about tolerance, and yet we truly don't really tolerate one another well. This demonstrates what it looks like to lead. And so just listen in to the authenticity of this friendship and some of the shocking ways in which God has brought people together and used people to find common ground, even when most people would think there was no possible way. So join me and let's listen to this 18-minute conversation. just start us off at the beginning. How did your relationship with Ted begin?
It was after a broadcast, actually, we did with Linda Smith from Washington. She was talking about sex trafficking, and she's an attorney and a former congresswoman. And she graded, by looking at all the laws in each state, she graded each state. And Colorado received a D grade. And I sat in this broadcast and listened to this 17-year-old girl tell her story about how she was taken into sex trafficking, which, to be honest, I didn't know 100,000 young people every year taken into sex trafficking in the U.S. And it upset me. So after that broadcast, I thought, I wonder if the Gill Foundation would be interested in working together. And I was kind of channeled to give Ted a call, who he will describe that relationship with the Gill Foundation. But Ted and I met and had an incredible discussion about that issue, but also about spiritual issues. And I think it formed the basis of our relationship, our friendship.
Ted, I mean, what happened when you saw that the president of Focus on the Family was trying to get in touch with you and pursuing, like, just having a conversation? Was that kind of full freak out mode, or were you kind of interested in engaging that?
First response was, is it April 1st?
Yeah.
Actually, now that we've known each other these 2 years or so, maybe longer than that, I regret being the one that didn't reach out to him. And that Jim was the one that reached out to me. It's just a little bit of a, not ego thing, but it's like he thought of the idea first. But I have to say I was surprised. And I can tell you, everybody in my firm, everyone asked me, they're like, are you sure? He's going to come here? I'm like, of course I want to meet with him. One, I've heard great things about him, but also I think you reach a certain point where you get a lot more achieved by having a conversation with somebody than not.
Yeah. Jim, what did your friends think about this pursuit of a new relationship with one of the leading gay activists in the country?
It was wide-ranging. I mean, it was good. That's the thing to do. Let's find solutions. Let's look for that common space where we can work together. I certainly appreciated that support. But it was also, on the other end of it, some donors who called and said, listen, if you're going to work with people like him, I'm not going to support you anymore. And you got to decide what you're going to do. And I think for me, that's not acceptable. And it was more like, keep your cash.
Yeah. For this cause, I mean...
Well, no, it's true. And I don't mean that. I can be a little belligerent. But, I just don't see that attitude in the gospel. And Ted is not my enemy. He's somebody that Christ died for, just like me. And I think one of the greatest difficulties we have in the church is we have this thing like, yeah, Jesus died for me, but I'm a pretty good guy. Don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, really, so I do all these right things. I have all this right behavior. Therefore, of course, Jesus would die for me.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you guys, that's a dangerous place to be. We're all sinners saved by grace. And all I want to do in the relationship with Ted, one, is to express that love. I think there's something really special about the Lord saying, love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've experienced this, but by doing that sincerity of care, when you feel that, you are drawn together. You have a greater openness to that human being. And I think the Lord, it wasn't a flippant comment that he made, love your neighbor. Because I think he stamped in our hearts, into our DNA, that knittedness that occurs when you actually sincerely care about somebody. It's in us because we're made in the image of God. And when you do it, it's irresistible. Both ways.
Yeah. And I have to say that our relationship, in terms of the benefit that it's had for me, first off, those folks that I work with within the gay community, everybody knows I've worked with and represented Tim Gill and the Gill Foundation. This will be the 18th year. I'm here today as Ted Trimpa. If you want to know their opinion, I encourage you to call and ask them. So I want to be very clear about me. But I can say that when I say I've been working with Jim, that I've been working with Focus on the Family, after I picked them up off the floor, what has happened, though, and I'm playing off of this concept of love your neighbor, and for me, kind of a grander thought around the philosophy of love, it's infectious. And how they then react to you on other issues that you may be working, I've been a little surprised. There's just some naturalness of that warmth for me that has spilled into other things that I do.
And Ted, you guys specifically worked on human trafficking laws in the legislature here. Why did I know you're strategic, like you think about how to get things done, and in this way it seemed to make sense. Tell us a little bit more specifically about what you guys did together here in Colorado.
Well, when Jim came in and described the problem, my first reaction was one of shock. I'm like, how can this be in a state that I consider to be somewhat progressive in a generally progressive way, not a democratic way? A state that is known not for that. And when you looked at the statistics, comparing all of our neighboring states, basically going up and down the I-25 corridor, in terms of state law, we were the worst by a lot. And then I got to thinking about it, I'm like, we're worse than Wyoming? So then I immediately thought, we got to fix this. I'm a little competitive. The second piece was thinking about how to get it done. And like anything in Colorado, with the taxpayer bill of rights and how we do budgeting, there's always a limitation on money. And with the two of us, with Jim coming in with some of the more traditional, what I would consider right-wing conservatives, Christian conservatives, and me coming in from the perceived left and helping ensure through a Democratic House that we would get the money, it really made, which really is a no-brainer to do, a much more likely reality, given the fact that we could then provide the money. Yeah. And the other thing I have to say, too, is that that was just the first step of many things that we have been doing together and we want to continue doing together. And I see my relationship with Jim and what we do not as just about things that don't directly affect where we may have opposing views. I saw it as the first step of building a relationship and trust and that love so that there are more difficult issues where on some core beliefs or perspectives we could disagree, but there has to be somewhere in there, and where I'm going is talking about the stability of families and the best interest of children and encouraging couples to stay together and families to stay together. There has to be some commonality here. And where we have that commonality, I'm not going to judge him, in my non-evangelical sense, about how he views marriage, and raising children, and he won't do the same to me. But we know we have this higher value of stability in kids that we're trying to do.
Well, and I think in adding to that, some of our early meetings always started with our hand gestures going, you're not going to change my mind when it comes to marriage. And you'd say, and you're not going to change my mind. I mean, you remember those early meetings? And we would say things like, okay, now that we got that out of the way, what can we do? And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But it is that acknowledgement. It's okay. We can disagree deeply on the definition of marriage and the value of marriage in the culture, but it doesn't mean we need to go out of our way to be hated.
So, if you start the conversation, that statistic you were showing me earlier, if you start the conversation with gay marriage is wrong, well, first of all, I take issue with calling it gay marriage. If it's gay marriage, then it's a happy one, because I think of like gay in the 50s.
Should we bring gay back as just a normal term? Happy
marriage.
Right?
I thought just a little side story. When Governor Hickenlooper was first talking about gay marriage, marriage equality, I begged him when he was going to meet the press. I said, I swear to God, if you say gay marriage, we are going to put up planes carrying gay marriage as a happy marriage. Anyway, if you start the conversation with marriage equality is wrong or gay marriage is wrong, then you're precluding so many other conversations that you can have. Because we may disagree about what the definition of marriage is, but there are a whole lot of things that we do agree on that we can do a lot of good.
Yeah, and Jim, I know from firsthand experience how much a personal relationship does help you take a deeper look at these kinds of topics. And I know you know for Ted, this topic of gay marriage, happy marriage, as Ted would describe it. Always campaigning, right? Even here.
You got it.
I think what we find is it does help us to have a sensitivity and understanding. And I'm just wondering for you personally, leading focus on the family, but just as a human being, as Jim Daly, how has this relationship with Ted even given you a deeper look into what many sit back here and go, oh, the gay rights movement? And you've had a little more of a personal look at that with Ted. Talk to us from how that personal relationship maybe has shaped how you think about Ted?
Yeah, I think at the macro level, when I first got to know Ted, it's the thing we suffer with, all of us suffer with this, and that is we think of each other's tribe in a very monolithic way. The gay community is this way. This is what they think about religious freedom. This is how they want to take this away. And I would think, although Ted will answer this, I'm sure that's the stereotype with the Christian community. And so one of the first things that I learned just getting to know Ted is that he has a deep respect for religious liberty. He's concerned about it. We wouldn't agree on some aspects of that, on public accommodation and some other things, but I was surprised to hear Ted show deference to religious liberty, because my monolithic view was everybody in the gay community wants to trump religious liberty, and now I understand that that's not totally accurate.
And Ted, I mean, I'd love for you to say the same. I mean, what the perspective I'm sure that many within your community have of evangelicals and the right-wing Christians, how has that started to alter in any way just because you've had this personal relationship with Jim?
Looking kind of at the macro level, one, the focus on the family piece first, and then the evangelical and Christian community second, because for me, there are actually two different experiences. For the work that I've done in Colorado and that I've done with Tim, or representing him, for many years, focus on the family was the big evil. And we were in pitched battle over issue after issue. And I remember, depictions that would come from certain parts of the political arm that no longer is there, but that would have Tim depicted with snakes coming out of his head. And, we were down and out, and we said nasty things about them. Today, listen, that was the past. I apologize for anything that I ever said that was bad, wrong, and mean. The way that we get forward is look forward, which is what we do. With Christians and evangelicals, the impact has been even bigger for me. And that is, when I mention, and I use this a lot, particularly in left circles that I work in, but then also in just generally gay circles, I use this relationship to show that we can't be monolithic on how we view the other side. I mean, I always talk in terms of, I hate using the word compromise, because compromise is a negative frame. It means that everybody feels like they're having to give up something. I love the term common ground, because common ground is a positive frame and way of looking at it. And when I mention the work that we do together, our friendship that we have together, and then when I hear people say negative things that are kind of stereotypical about evangelicals or Christians, I now have a more authentic base to say something back, because they're not going to believe me being an evangelical. Trust me, anybody who knows me, they would never believe that. And I mean that in a very nice way. That's just who I am. I'm sure you've heard that one all the time. It's like when I used to, well, I still lobby at the state capitol, but used to have, more conservative Republican legislators, after they would cast what I would perceive as an anti-gay vote, they would come off the floor and they would come up to me and they're like, Ted, I'm sorry, it's not about you. And I would always respond, oh, I know, some of my best friends are Jewish. And they just, it takes a while, but it finally soaks in. So I want this to go farther than where it is today. Mm-hmm. And I think that we spend far too much time, many people within the gay community, a number of people within the more left progressive community, vilifying Christianity or looking more skeptically at evangelicals. At least a third of the LGBT community is at least somewhat religious, if not very religious. Yeah. Belief in God and even being evangelical, it's there, and there are a lot of them. And we would talk in that common ground frame, positive frame, rather than negative compromise frame, we'll go so much farther.
Yeah. Jim, would you just share, we have so many leaders, pastors, leading organizations here in the same situation you're in, where they have a lot of people within their communities that may not quite understand why they would reach out, why they would take that first step into a space where, immediately in this culture, you're seen as compromising, as Ted said, just because you're beginning a relationship. How would you encourage them to continue forward and to really remove that fear from how they think about this?
Yeah, I think that's it. Have courage. And I think know who you are. I mean, the one thing that really offended me is that Christian leaders who knew that I was reaching out, not just in Ted's direction, but with those in other areas of conflict with a traditional Christian viewpoint, abortion, things like that, they would send me a note and they would say, how could you betray us like this? And I'm sitting here thinking, it's a taste perhaps of what the Lord felt when the Pharisees, I'm afraid to say it, would ridicule the Lord for engaging people that didn't think the way the Pharisees thought, right? And I just think we think that behavior is gone and we've gotten beyond being Pharisaical. It is alive and well, and we've got to recognize it in the church. And we've got to run from it because there's two things that I see in the New Testament: salvation through Christ and don't become a Pharisee. And there are, isn't that true? I mean, that's what Jesus was saying. And so when I read it, my thing is to always be true to that. And I just think there are a lot of cousins of Caiaphas walking around. And man, I don't want to be that. And the other thing is I better do all I can to make sure I can influence the people around me that think that way to rethink how they're thinking. Because it's a dangerous place to be when you're judging other people in a way that is not your position to do that. What I want Ted to see in our relationship is the love of Christ, certainly the truth of what I believe, and I think our friendship is strong enough that Ted can bear that, and vice versa. And I think at the end of the day, that's what the Lord will either smile about or frown upon. And I trust in that process. And I think, again, the only arsenal in the tool chest that we have in the spiritual context is the love of God. Everything else is human. The love of God is hard to defeat. And that's what I want to express.
And I mean this very sincerely, I feel it every time I'm with you. No, I really do.
That's kind, Ted. That's the Lord.
And I realize we're almost done. I went through open heart surgery last August. It was a complete surprise. One day I thought I was fine. 3 weeks later, I was in New York under the knife. And someone who I know was always praying for me, was always checking on me, and I could feel the presence, was Jim. And that's just something I'll never forget.
Wow. Well, thank you both for sharing your friendship with us. It's so awesome. It's so great listening to that back, but if you could have been in the room, I mean, you can kind of feel how people were just so enamored by the fact that here's these two people leading different things, but who have a genuine spirit of care, concern, love, and friendship. And I'm glad you've gotten to listen in on it. But one of the things you can also do is you can actually watch this talk. So this talk right now is at qideas.org. You could watch it, share it with your friends. And that's one of the things, all of these talks from Q Denver will be releasing throughout the end of the summer and the fall. And if you want to be alerted to every time a new talk's being released weekly, you can go to qideas.org, provide us with your email address, and we'll be in touch with you. Otherwise, share this podcast with your friends. Invite them to come in. We're going to be taking the next several weeks, and we're going to be showcasing for you several of our favorite talks that have taken place recently at our National Q Conference that we believe will encourage you, will speak to you no matter what industry you're serving in. But if you care about the Christian faith being engaged in culture, this podcast is going to be a place not only for you, but for your friends, your colleagues, family members, those who are trying to navigate their way through what it looks like to live faithfully in a society that's rapidly changing around us, but where God calls us to lead with love and joy in the midst of different circumstances. And so join us for that, and we'll be back next week for our next Q podcast.